and welcome to my 15th weekly wrap-up. I am a graduate student. I am studying for a Master's of Forestry to be able to facilitate more understanding and appreciation of the values of forests. This is almost the end of my second semester at NAU. I have one more week, so this was the end of classes, and then I have finals. I am going over 3 classes: forest insects, ecological economics, and an independent study that I'm taking to understand more the values of forests. Alright, so in insects we looked at the future. The impact of forest insects is increasing at an exponential rate. A lot of this is due to globalization. You can order a plant from anywhere and it will be delivered to you. So we have the possibility of a lot more infestation happening. My professor said that he feels like everyone needs to be aware of these issues. And one of the goals is to get better at identifying exotic species before they become an issue, but it's really difficult. Like with the emerald ash borer, you can go to Asia where the insect is from and you can hardly even find it, and yet it has killed millions and millions of ash here in the United States. So identification prior to it becoming a critical threshold is really difficult. We looked at several of the main concepts were the impacts that might happen, and that's beyond the primary impact. So for example, honeybees, there's a parasite that gets into their nest, and the parasite carries, there's a mite that gets into the nest and it has a parasite, and that is being very devastating to the honeybee populations. The pesticides that have been used are also having a significant impact on the honeybees, and of course the honeybees populate our food, so pollinate our food. So that's a secondary impact that is of great importance for us. Let's see. Oh, one of the things she said was if you're a beekeeper, you should clean out the box because that's going to help with the parasite that's in there, and you might even be able to sterilize the queen bee. I don't have any idea how you would do that. Let's see, the next thing was response that forest insects are having to the changes in climate patterns. It's really difficult to model what climate change might do to insect populations. They have so many different phases, as we have talked about. They have several different hosts often. So, like for example, if the temperature goes up, there's a possibility that the insects population will be able to be more rapid. But if the temperature goes up, in certain areas there won't be as much snowpack, and the insects rely on that snowpack for temperature control, so it's real hard to do that. Also, like an example, here in Arizona, in the northern part of Arizona, we have the mountain pine beetle, but it's really kept in check because the western pine beetle and the southern pine beetle are more productive here, and they have shorter life cycles, whereas the mountain pine beetle has a 1-year cycle. Well, if it gets warmer, that mountain pine beetle might be able to have more generations in a year, and so it might actually begin to outcompete the western and the southern that are keeping it in check. So it's real hard to see what's going on. A term I believe I've used before, but it's a really good description, is that it's an exotic forest land with native insects. So the animals and insects, they can move, but the trees cannot move. So when the climate change is so new, the insects can go to another area, so they're where they're native, but the trees are now going to be in an exotic climate. What else would I like to say about those? The next one we looked at is Interdisciplinary Approach, and that has been consistent throughout all of my classes, that we need to begin to have a lot more voices and a lot more people gathered together with their different intellects to be able to really look at these issues. One thing that is going on that was real cool in the technical aspect is they have 3D printers that it's beyond my comprehension how this happens, but it has pheromones and they are released as they're needed. So instead of just broadly putting those pheromones out, they will put them out as they're needed to try and attract these insects to a certain location. Another super cool thing is they can actually do CT scans on insects. They can do it on the mountain pine beetle, which is like 1 millimeter big, and they can do this CT scans on it, and they look for the fungal area to try and be able to identify how to better address that outbreak. We need to think beyond pesticides because they obviously are not working and they are destructive, and they, more importantly, or equally important, they don't address why. There is no sense of how these things are happening. We're just trying to band-aid them, and that's not working. Then we looked at the need for more intensive management of forests. We're just going to need to help them. We need to help them to be able to persist and be more viable. So that is probably working with silvicultural techniques, which is just the management of a forest to try and really see how to help the trees with these new climates that they're facing so that their stresses are not so bad that insects have a real ability to have a huge outbreak. We need to find some more detection tools, like the ones I mentioned before that my professor is working on with the iPhone to hear if the bugs are inside the tree. We have more taxonomists are needed. They are dying. It's an old industry job, and it's hard to get money just to do taxonomy work, but you have to be able to identify the bug because, like I said, there's so many different stages in it, and you really need the person there, even if you have the genetics, to be able to identify certain parts of it. One thing, two, the U.S. Forest Service, they used to have like 1,000 entomologists, but in the last 20 or 30 years, it's dropped down to that many. Like they have only about 20, 30 entomologists for the United States Forest Service in the United States. Because there just money isn't there, probably it's all going to fire. Then another thing that was cool was like with the wood wasp, they were trying to spray for that during the summer. Well, if you're not an entomologist, you don't know that the wood wasp pupates in the ground in the summertime, so there was no use in spraying for it. So we need some more entomologists. There's some really cool career jobs out there. You can travel around the world. You can actually live in or be in other locations because you could recognize the things that you might know in your forest, but they wouldn't know them in this new exotic place. Forest pests, he said, are a people problem. That's why we need to ask why it is happening. There are certain places where we know more about it, and also we need to get to the point where, like particularly with agriculture, like maybe a little bit of a blemish on an apple is a good thing, because then the insects would persist, but they would be kept in check, whereas right now we're trying to just eradicate and it doesn't work. So maybe take a clue from the South, because they grow more of their own food, and so when they go to the grocery store, they see a little blemish here and there. It's like no big deal. They know that the food is still fine. My professor said the number one thing that we can do to help our forests is to slow down climate change. There are 50,000 to 100,000 acres in Arizona alone where the trees are under great stress, and it's not because of insects, it's because of climate change. So that is our number one priority for our forests, and our forests are a priority because they supply so many ecosystem services for us. Oh, and this was just an observation that I had. Well, I'll say this first. The other thing that the professor suggested is we need local seeds. Right now, Like, so many of the seeds come from one location, so there's not any genetic diversity, and that is an extreme problem. When any insect would come in, free game, full buffet. So if you're gonna be planting things, then make sure you're getting local seeds, or you at least know your seed source. And also the other suggestion was to try and get more local food, if you live in a place where they can actually grow local food. Then my observation was that the forest and the world is having, natural world is having as much reaction to all of this change that's going on as we are, that there's a lot of globalization happening and a lot of new cultural shifts and paradigm shifts going on in our world. Well, the trees are facing their own globalized issues, and so let's have some sympathy for them and take care of them. All right, our word for this one is entomology. That is a branch of zoology concerned with the study of insects, and it lists a couple of different, several different jobs that you could go into. It is a very connected part of the world, and as our forest, the whole concept of a forest is connectivity. So, some of the jobs include, you could go into ag or biological research, you could be a forest entomologist, which is what we've been studying, you could go to conservation and environmental biology, pharmaceutical industries use it. Do you remember about the ovipositor, and that they use that to come up with brain surgery tools? And then you could also do natural resources management. So if you're interested in insects, we need you. The Ecological Economics class, we really looked at the roles that our values play as managers and policymakers for the future. We need to be very cognizant of where our values come from, what the cognitive hierarchy is, and we looked at that with our relationship to nature. I have known, or looked back on my life and realized that my grandparents' farm had a very strong impact on my appreciation for nature. But going through this process of the cognitive hierarchy and really identifying where your values came from, I realized my grandmother that lived on that farm, she had gone through the Great Depression, and so she was very conscious of how valuable everything was. And I feel like my understanding of the preciousness and the fragileness of the environment probably was very influenced by her experiences of the Great Depression. So that was a pretty cool connection that I made. We looked at how the fear of a changing societies sends people to an interest in authoritarian government. And we can see that has happened in the last 5 years in a couple of different areas here in the United States as well as in Brazil, that when you see so much change happening, you want control of some kind, even if that means that your government is controlling you. So that is an interesting place to find some compassion for people where they are experiencing a lot of change and uncertainty. That is the next thing we looked at, is actually the concept of uncertainty. And that science, that's what it's about. Science asks questions. So it wants to find out, like, what is happening, rather than feeling like we actually know answers. So we are comfortable with uncertainty. Our education system does not promote that. It promotes right and wrong, and we need to be more taught to work through things and think critically. So that's we kind of sum that up with, is how to address, measure, and influence the minds and hearts of people. That science is, like everything else right now, going through uncharted territory. That it's just the scale that it's happening has never really been experienced before. We looked at post-normal science. Normal science was kind of puzzle pieces looking for those answers, and post-normal is really getting all these different voices together as you are creating the science, so that you know that it is some useful, applicable science. We also looked a little bit at post-truth politics. And again, as I mentioned, finding a way to understand and be compassionate, because if we understand values, that might be a path towards sustainability, and we all want the earth to last. Next, we looked at invasive species and how those alter ecosystem functions. A lot of what we did with that particular one, you and I have looked at in our forest insects class. But one thing in the article was it's estimated that it's $120 billion impact in losses and damages a year. So if we were to be more proactive and find some ways to identify these bugs, such as at importation border patrol areas, so if that's another job for you, then that might be have a really good return of investment if we can identify these things before they become a problem here. And also, like the economics of certain infestations, they might not affect us directly, but they will later on. Back to the honeybees. And the market, is it actually useful to come up with market values for the economic and both economic and ecological losses? It is a common language, and it helps us really come up with some incentives, but it might not be the place to stay. The only place to stop in looking at how to deal with issues. We looked at some policy management tools and the need for maintaining wild genetic diversity. Rather than like saying cut down all the trees, we would need to keep some of them there so that they have that genetic diversity, which will help with maintaining resilience. And I think that's, and the last one was, like, how do you give performance and credit to things that are prevented? So that's a really kind of interesting concept and hard to come up with. The word for the day for ecological economics is why. And that is a reason, a cause, or I forgot the other one. I forgot to write it down. But like why is very important in all of these classes. Why we're doing this, why we're looking at things, why they happen. In my independent study, the questionnaire is shaping up. There's a couple of ways to look at it. You can do bottom-up analysis, which really is letting the person I'm interviewing lead the process, and that is called open-ended interview style. Then there's semi-structured, where it's really guided with a clear objective, which is what I'm going to be doing. The reason that I want to put in a lot of quantitative data that I'm asking people is that supports and bolsters my qualitative questions that I want to understand about why and how and the values that people hold. I thought I was going to be looking for leverage points, but that is an extremely technical term. One of the issues with it is you have to really assess the cost, that you want to be able to shift the system, but you need to understand the cost that might be happening with that system. So my professor asked me if I ever rode horses, and I said yes, and I told him the best way to shift it is with your weight, but you can, maybe most radically effective is with the mouth, but that's really terrible for your horse. So that's an example of how you want to find the proper leverage points without hurting the system. Okay, so mostly I'm going to be looking at patterns. I'm also going to be looking for barriers, how people are dealing with their trash, how they are not dealing with it, what they thought about for taking care of pollution when they went on their hike. Did they consider what they needed to do with their discarded used toilet paper so that it's not discarded, it's just used? And then to be able to think about your footprint before you head out on the hike. So I'm looking to see what people know, how much they support, and what they care about in terms of pollution and particularly duped. Okay. And looking for solutions. So the word for my independent study is footprint. It's an area occupied or affected by something in terms of just like the general notion of a footprint, but within the ecological world, it has the impact on the environment of human activity in terms of pollution, damage, or depletion to natural resources. And I would like to encourage us to think, can we have a positive footprint and actually make things better for our ecological world? The poem, there was no author. It is from the University of Miami website, Progress in Science, relies on thorough study, clear thought, and teamwork. And that's a really good analysis of my semester. I have one more wrap-up, so I will wrap up my wrap-ups next week. Ciao!